Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a neurodiverse journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with me? Perhaps the biggest challenge we face in the neurodivergent community is getting others to accept that there is nothing wrong with us. We just think and perform differently. And given the right circumstances in businesses who choose to accept that and create the right conditions, then neurodivergent talent can be a great asset. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Ed Thompson, the CEO and founder of Uptimize. For the last 7 years, Uptimize has been committed to communicating and advising businesses of that exact message. Later this month, Ed will be launching his first book entitled A Hidden Force, Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work to educate and spread that message even further. Let me tell you a bit about today's guest. Ed Thompson is the founder and CEO of Uptimize, the leading neuro inclusion training company whose mission is to help organizations embrace and leverage every type of thinker. Born and raised in London and educated at the University of Oxford, Ed founded Uptimize in 2016, recognizing the urgent need for a greater understanding and appreciation of neurodiversity within the working world. His role with Uptimize has afforded him unique insights and connections with pioneers in the neurodiversity at work field across the world, and he is now a frequent speaker on the topic. He and Uptimize have been featured by outlets including LinkedIn, the BBC, People Management Magazine, HR.com, and the Financial Times. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before we get into the book and its message, I want to start off with why you started Uptimize.
Yeah, absolutely. And I used to get this question all the time because, back in the day, there were very few people apparently in the neurodiversity at work space, and everybody would ask everybody else, what was your story and sort of how are you mad enough to be spending your time on this when the rest of the world, doesn't care about it. My story was never the quickest to explain. I actually had no background in diversity or people or talent until I worked for the CEO of a tech company in London. I got very involved in that side of things at that point because his priorities, which of course were my priorities, were how do we hire the best talent? How do we hire people who think differently? How do we build the workforce of the future? We were conscious to some extent that the team we had probably looked rather the same and probably thought the same and so on. So got involved in diversity and strategic diverse recruitment, saw the value of that. I got interested in neurodiversity talking to autistic family members who said you should be looking at our field. And at the time, it was very nascent. Again, there were very few companies or folks looking at this. And that resonated with me, really, the experiences of the neurodivergent and the challenges in employment resonated with me, not just because of my family members, but because I'd had a traumatic brain injury myself. So I think I saw an opportunity to bring some of what I built and learned with my previous job to the neurodiversity at work space, specifically to train companies in what neurodiversity truly means and how they can embrace talent that thinks in different ways. And that's a mission and a journey we've been on ever since.
Fantastic. Now it's interesting because there's a couple of things to unpack there, and one of the key things that resonated with me in you answering the question was businesses and people were saying to you, why are you spending your time on this? We don't have time on this to waste on. Why is that there that kind of perception and attitude?
Yeah, well, I think businesses exist within their societies. So we can't kind of divorce the two. I think we have to look at the society as a whole. And really the ignorance of neurodiversity at a societal level over the last few decades. I mean, this is a term that was first coined only in the 90s. Now, diversity and inclusion as a whole really was birthed in the 60s. You have still, I think, a pretty patchy understanding of neurodiversity. Of course, that's changing. More people get access to diagnosis. More and more people and famous people through social media talking about being neurodivergent. And it's increasingly obvious that many of the great business people of our time think differently. And that's a great reason for their success. but I think we're still in an age where this awareness and understanding is pretty low. And yes, it's changing, but it's a low baseline. So it's low. It's also, I think, often wrong in that it's fueled by misconceptions of the community, as you said at the beginning. You know, it's about actually appreciating what people can do and their abilities. But I think there are all sorts of negative stereotypes when it comes to neurodivergent people, and so I think those fuel and that ignorance and that stereotype fuel misconceptions around this topic. Misconceptions like, you know, we don't have anybody like that here. That's something that we hear. Or, you know, oh, we possibly have a role over here where, you know, somebody neurodivergent could do, but, you know, we've never tried it. Or, you know, would they be a fit with our culture? And all of these things, when you unpick them, are nonsense, right? Because every organization is already neurodiverse. Any organization of size is likely to have significant neurodivergent representation if we just look at the proportion of humans who are likely neurodivergent. So I think, again, that the societal ignorance misconceptions are fueled by that. And we have, to some extent, you know, to try to break those down together, which I know, you know, is part of your work as well.
There's a lot of things there that I agree with. Now, you also mentioned in your opening answer, and it's also, you pointed it out during our prep talk in regards to the CEO that you work with, who I believe you also mentioned as being your mentor, in regards to looking at how different people think. In particular, you have pointed out two particular points that I recall, which is the lifespan of business and why it's important to bring in new different perspectives, and also innovation is actually people. Can you expand on those two concepts?
Yeah, totally. And I think you've seen, you know, what happened with my former boss really was that CEO priorities are, you know, are what HR priorities used to be. So HR priorities used to be, you know, talent, diversity, building innovative teams, whatever it is, keeping people around. Now, I think all of those priorities to some extent have become CEO priorities. They've become CEO priorities because of tight talent markets, particularly, you know, in tech, changing expectations from the workforce, particularly as millennials and Gen Xers, you know, really take over. And so, you know, there's really a challenge, I think, for organizations to attract and keep talent. But yeah, to particularly focus on the innovation part of that. You know, innovation today for organizations isn't just a nice to have. It really is an essential if you're going to avoid, you know, being out innovated by competitors, you know, losing market share, being disrupted, and so on. And yes, I believe the lifespan of companies has plummeted significantly from, you know, close to sort of 60 years about 50 years ago to today being about 15 years, and again falling rapidly. So when we see CEOs talking about, you know, we need to innovate, they're not just saying that for the sake of it. And I think often they don't know how to do it. And I think what we have here with our community and what we've seen in organizations is the belief and to some extent the evidence that if you can build teams of people who think in different ways, that is a great route to more innovative outcomes.
It's interesting. I think the reason why they don't know how to do it is because they're not looking at people as a way of innovating. They're looking at either acquiring another company or bringing out the new its to be able to
technology,
to expand the company, and they're missing that or not understanding that elements of that it's people that actually makes that happen. And you mentioned interesting because you kind of threw a caveat there, Ed, in regards what used to be the role of HR. So, because quite often we hear that, you know, these kind of conversations need to be taken up with human resources, and you're saying that's no longer their role. So, what is the role of HR now?
Well, no, I'm not saying it's no longer their role. I'm just saying that I think there was a time where people as a sort of priority was, I think, down the pecking order. And I remember an executive telling me that, look, every C-suite executive has to sort of decide what do they prioritize the most, you know, customers, is it people, or is it shareholders? And I think that's changed. And obviously, to some extent, you can prioritize all three. But I think the weighting of that has changed significantly towards people, as I explained. Now, I don't think that means HR's role has necessarily changed. I think it just means HR's role is all the more important, in the sense that HR should be, surfacing and then delivering on genuine high-level strategic priorities around people. And I always like to draw the comparison here with other fields. And I think if you look at the military, particularly in elite military units, if you look at sports teams, they understand that getting the right people and supporting the right people, that's their business, if you like. And I just think it's strange that in the corporate world, people as an important topic has just been kind of relegated, even though it's obviously every organization's biggest spend. And I think now that's changing. And so it's on HR. You asked me, what is the role of HR? I think it's on HR again to identify the solutions and to bring those solutions to the senior leaders, and to some extent to demonstrate to senior leaders that they have a solution to be a place where everybody wants to work, where everybody wants to stay, and where the team can perform, at a level to meet their goal.
Absolutely, and thank you for clearing that up. And it's also interesting, the sports analogy and the military analogy. I know another advocate in the UK who uses a sports analogy in regards to football on the pitch, and you actually use the same analogy in your book in regards to coaches ensuring that the players are utilized based on their strengths, and that there's other players there to support, their challenges where their focus really isn't at.
Yeah, I think I was asked the other day to talk about leadership and what I thought leadership meant. And I think that's a really interesting topic. And I think there's a lot of focus on leadership in terms of strategy. And I think there's a lot in terms of motivation. I like to think of leadership, again, more from the side of maybe a general manager in sports, where such a big part of that is actually building a team. It's team building. It's finding the best people, the right balance of people, and then putting them in a position to succeed. And I actually think that element of leadership is sometimes also, to some extent, overlooked. And it's obviously particularly important when you're talking about, how do we build teams where people can really and those teams can really leverage that diversity of thought.
That's really interesting, and we'll come back to that. But what I will add to that is that's quite often, and you're right, is that it's the frontline managers who are at the forefront of a business in managing teams. And they're the ones that tend to set the culture and the tone of that particular workforce and the team that they're managing. And if that general manager, the frontline manager, doesn't have the awareness and skill set, then that can have a great impact on that workforce and who they're managing, which then results will have an impact on the whole organization.
Yeah, I think sometimes those hiring managers don't feel they have a strategic mandate, and so they feel like their job is just filling the gap. So we had Bob, and Bob used to do this. Well, gosh, Bob's leaving, and now nobody's doing what Bob was doing. So let's get someone in ASAP. And they also, again, due to that societal ignorance of neurodiversity, I think often are not considering the fact that, for example, here, a candidate pool is made up of people who have all sorts of different brains, and therefore who may communicate or work or problem solve in different ways. And I think if you change that, if you sort of empowered people to be a little bit more strategic in their team building, and you improve the education of, what are we actually dealing with here? Well, our people are our most expensive asset, and what is the number one tool they're bringing to work every day? It's their brain. We might start being a little bit more focused and sensitive and effective in building those teams that can really achieve what we want them to achieve.
Right, absolutely. So then from your time in the last 7 years with Optimize and assisting businesses, how receptive have businesses been in accepting different people and how they think differently?
That's a great question. Of course, it's a range, and we've had cases where we've approached businesses and they've not been interested, and we've had cases where businesses have approached us and been incredibly enthusiastic and often really on the same page as us in terms of what is the challenge here, but also what is the opportunity. So it's a big range. I think what influences that, again, back to the fact that there's all these misconceptions, I think what influences that is looking at their competitors. I think it's looking for solutions to some of those challenges that we've discussed. And significantly, it is learning of the presence of neurodivergent staff within the organization. And bear in mind, there's some data from a couple of years ago that 90% of neurodivergent people at work typically don't disclose. You have this huge hidden workforce, alluding there to the title of my book. But I think that's changed as well. And actually, what some of the early neurodiversity hiring programs did was empower neurodivergent people at work to come together and to start to self-advocate. And so we've seen a lot of organizational initiatives come from a desire to support and further empower those groups. And even now, we have organizations coming to us saying, well, we've done a survey about diversity, and we said, what do people want us to cover? And neurodiversity came out at the top. So again, you're seeing that employee enthusiasm for this stuff, and it's so belated. I don't think we should be surprised about that. And that's marrying to some extent with that strategic priority, from the top. I don't think there's enough understanding yet that those business people-related priorities can be solved through neuro-inclusion. That's really a big message of my book, that they can. But you're starting to see those things meet in the middle.
Yeah, I would agree. You're starting to see a change, especially in the last 4 years since COVID, where there's been a lot more awareness and a lot more movement, particularly coming out of the UK in regards to the awareness that's happening. In fact, even just last month, on the eve of Neurodiversity Week, a new global index report had come out with some positive numbers, but still, unfortunately, some not so positive numbers in regards to where the needle is going. And I think also as well, it's that awareness and that hidden force. I think that will be determined by region.
Yeah, I think so, and even locally, and I think there's cases where communities are becoming more engaged around this topic. My book launch next week in person is with the Colorado Neurodiversity Chamber of Commerce, which is the first of its kind in the world, and is linking businesses and is linking neurodivergent people and allies within this community to come together and to explore solutions and celebrate successes. So I think it can come at different levels. Obviously, at Uptimize, what we do is global. We put content out for the global community. We have partners in different continents, but you can also see these initiatives, getting traction locally. And I know there's some European countries as well where that's the case, and there are charities and service providers that have really got this conversation going there, not just the UK.
Right. And let's just now dive into the book, Ed. First off, why did you decide to write this book?
Yes, I think this was very much a book that sort of I felt compelled to write. I was talking to somebody the other day, a multi-published author, and she said, there's one kind of book where you're sort of trying to come up with something and then you get it out there, and there's others that just sort of tumble out of you. And I think this was very much the latter for me. This field was just so exciting, and I think still is. The earliest conferences around neurodiversity at work, the buzz, the energy, the sense that something big was happening here, the sense that something far bigger would need to happen and could happen beyond. The response we saw and continue to see to our training in organizations, we would have very emotional responses from neurodivergent employees saying, this is so fantastic, I'm so pleased we're doing this training, this is changing my experience, but also feedback from, say, managers who would admit being cynics and would say things like, I wasn't sure this was going to be relevant to me, but this is the best thing I've heard in management for 20 years. And I just got a sense that there's some real magic here, magic from a business point of view, magic from a social impact point of view as well. And I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to share the learnings, the perspectives from all of the different organizations and people we've worked with, whether it's the neurodivergent community, it's academia, it's some of these big famous employers who've been pioneers in the field. And I wanted to share it with a broader audience. Now, the problem is, of course, I have a day job running the company. So my issue was, well, how on earth can I write a book alongside it? It was about 3 years ago, beginning of the first COVID lockdown, where I said to my wife on a socially distanced walk, wonder if I'll have time to get that book going. And 3 years later, here we are.
Fantastic. Now, we've kind of touched upon a couple of things here in leading up to this. And you take the readers into a history of neurodiversity and understanding what it means and the rise of the current movement we are in. What do you feel is behind the rapid growth of neurodiversity movement and how neurodiverse employers will shape the future of the work?
Well, that's a great question as well. I mean, first of all, I did that because I wanted to explain to people why we're talking about this now, why we hadn't been before, why some of these stereotypes had taken root, and where all this had come from. Because I want to help combat that ignorance and replace it with an appreciation of the reality of human neurodiversity, and then the way that, as societies, we've largely, misunderstood or ignored that, and then over the last 150 years or so, started to understand and a bit more, and then ultimately, embrace it. And I also wanted to trace, today's conversation to the rise of the neurodiversity movement in the 90s, which started to challenge some of those stereotypes and misconceptions and position neurodiversity as simply, a universal human difference, with, of course, neurodivergent people contextualized within that human spectrum. And so I think what we're seeing to some extent now is the flowering and the development of that neurodiversity, early neurodiversity movements, early advocacy. Now, to your question, why has that sort of suddenly taken off specifically in my field, which is the business field? I think it's partly the rise of and rise of importance of diversity and inclusion as a whole. And about 10 years ago, I think there were some very influential reports that really did demonstrate that being more diverse and more inclusive creates better business outcomes. It's all of those business priorities we've talked about, and people looking for solutions. How do we keep talent around? How do we attract the best talent? How do we be a place where people want to work? How do we boost belonging and well-being? That was a big priority through COVID. And again, how do we innovate? And then far more cultural, a conversation around neurodiversity, which I think has come from greater, increasing access to diagnoses, more and more appreciation of the proportion of people who are likely neurodivergent. As I mentioned, social media with neurodivergent people, famous or not famous, talking about their experiences. So I think we just have this kind of changing cultural landscape that, again, businesses are part of. And it so happens that just at this moment, again, businesses are searching for solutions to these big people challenges. And I just think it's a really a fit that, again, I hope my book will catalyze that people start to see the fit between those two things.
Hey, listeners, I want to share with you a new program that I put together to bring awareness and to up-level the skills of employers and managers. This workshop aids in building a more inclusive environment in the workplace for neurodivergent talent and developing the skills of management to be more engaging with their teams. Reach out to me on my website to learn more about this amazing program. Well, that's a great answer, and thank you for sharing that. And definitely that message really comes out in the book. There's definitely, as we discussed, there's been a lot of great more awareness. I think the challenge there is that society is still not ready for it, meaning that, when we take a look at what's happening in regards to, let's say, the UK, where they're overwhelmed and there's a huge waiting list to get diagnosed. Or we look at how, yes, some businesses are transforming, but other businesses are still unsure of how to become more acceptive and aware of who they're already employing, as well as trying to attract that kind of talent. There's still, what's the word I'm looking for? As much progress there's been, there's also still that hurdle to overcome. One of the common themes in the book, from chapter 4 to 6, you list out, particular challenges, and you tell some particular stories in relation to those challenges. In particular, when it comes to communication behavior, which leads to masking, which in itself becomes a result of harsh rebuttals due to lack of understanding. As a result, there are a lot of roadblocks for neurodiverse talents in their career. And this, of course, can lead into serious mental health. How can we tackle this successfully based on your experience?
Absolutely, there are all sorts of barriers. I call them boulders in the road, whether it's to getting hired or being comfortable and your most productive self at work. How do we change that? Again, I think we have to start with the typical fact that although every interaction at work, whether it's an interview, whether it's a discussion between a boss and one of their direct reports, most of the time, because people haven't been taught about neurodiversity, people are not thinking about neurodiversity in those interactions, and they're not thinking about neuro inclusion. They're not thinking about the fact that they are bringing their own thinking style to those interactions, and that's okay. But so is everybody else. And actually, to optimize them and to make people feel comfortable, again, productive, we want to be able to accommodate and understand that everybody, thinks differently. So to me, and the way that we work at Uptimize, we really focus on that. We don't assume people know a ton about this, because where have they ever been taught? So we try to create a baseline where people begin to approach those interactions, recognizing that fact. So if I'm a manager and I have a team, recognizing that the way I like to do things, the way I like to communicate, the way I like to problem solve, the way I like to communicate with candidates, whatever it is, I'm your manager and this is what works best for me, but it might not work for you. So, let's each other. You can have those conversations with autistic, dyslexic, or work. An environment that there. What I like about that is I think that's then the door to everything else. And I think as you start educating HR people or recruiters or managers about this topic, naturally they start realizing all sorts of places where they can start applying inclusive principles. It could be in meetings, it could be in assessments, but once people are thinking about the fact that all these interactions are taking place between different brains, good things start to happen.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to share a LinkedIn post that I came across yesterday, and I'd like to get your insight on that. And it's from a neurodiversity advocate in Australia, and she made two particular statements that I want to share with you. Neurotypicals are not the benchmark. Thus, neurodiversities do not have executive function deficits. Then that means that we need to create neurodiversity affirming workplaces. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I understand that right, I do think that there's an issue that we as societies, can focus on, if you like, what's normal, and see, disability or neurodivergence as deviations from that norm. And of course, I think the idea of, normal is actually something that we really need to challenge. And I know there's people who've done studies in this field of cognitive profiles, and because of those studies have a sense of, if you like, what normal might look like somewhere in the middle, but they've never found anybody who exactly matches normal. So I think we have to challenge this idea that, neurotypicals in the workplace are the big majority and basically they're fine, and there's a few neurodivergent people who need support. I think that's nonsense. I think we should be saying, look, every team, every organization is neurodiverse, meaning it has all sorts of people with all sorts of different brains. Of course, some people within that organization might have particularly strong preferences around, say, how they organize their work, or where they work. But that's fine, and let's embrace those, and let's start with the fact that, again, the team's neurodiverse. We value, obviously, everybody in the team. We want them to be able to do their best work. Let's have the conversations. Let's have the support to enable them to do so. Regardless of whether or not they've put their hand up and said, "Hi, look, I'm dyslexic and I need this support." We know if we only do that, we're only going to get 1 in 10 people who do it, and I don't think we can blame the 9 in 10 who think, well, why should I bother?
Yeah, you're right, and you understood it correctly. At the end of the day, it's about the neurotypical way, or the social norms of the neuro majority is not necessarily the only way or necessarily the right way of doing things. It's about accepting and recognizing that there are other ways of doing it, and that's, once again, as you pointed out, respecting and valuing how people think and perform, and what we've labeled as a potentially executive function defects or not defects is just about how they think and perform differently, and it's accepting that and creating the right environments for them to be able to excel. Just focusing on that 1 out of 10, the typical homogeneous, is not necessarily the solution, especially if you're looking for diverse ways of thinking to become more competitive in business.
Totally, and that's one of the challenges we face. And you talked about, how do businesses react to that? I think there's businesses who are infused, but they want to start with, right, they want to start with a show of hands. They want to start with, right, who's dyslexic, who's autistic, and what do you need? So they want to provide the support, but their whole framework around neurodiversity, to me, is wrong and unrealistic, and that's not how human brains work. And in fact, it's this very kind of muddy landscape of shared traits. I like to think of them, and you've seen in the book, as dials on a mixing board. It's a very complex thing, and again, lots of people in neurodivergent don't necessarily know it and haven't had access to diagnosis. A lot of people are neurodivergent and don't want to tell you about it. So the idea that this is something we can draw a line like with veterans or something and say, right, you're all veterans because you all served in Iraq and you're not, so veterans are going to get something special. It doesn't work in this field.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it's, understanding there's a interconnective pathways in the human brain that once again, it's just appreciating how we all think and perform differently, and allowing, and not categorizing and labeling people and isolating them in particular organizations. And with that, in your book, in one of the chapters, you talk about neurodiversity as a talent strategy, and you bring such examples as Deloitte and what they have found internally in their studies. In that, you highlight how inclusion improved performance and return of investment. I found this as a tough message to sell based on the current structures and attitudes. What do businesses need to understand to come to this realization?
Well, I think, again, I would start with the business priorities that I think are pretty much universal at the moment around talent, and how do we hire the best people? How do we keep them around? How do we put them in a position to be their best selves and innovate? And within that, we have all of these topics like innovation, well-being, belonging, retention, talent acquisition, all of that stuff. All of those priorities exist already. I don't think if we were joined now with a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I don't think we find one that didn't say, yes, all of those things really matter to me and are close to the top of my list of priorities. So I think what we need to do, and what we at Uptimize are working towards as best we can with our customers, is to be able to demonstrate that the fairly obvious proposition that if we start paying attention to the fact that we all think differently across all aspects of people and talent management, good things will happen. And in particular, as we see it, this will help create places where people want to work and feel comfortable. And we know that in today's world with Glassdoor and so on, is a big driver for talent acquisition. Significant chunk of, I think about 20% of new hires are employee referrals. So I mean, that's a powerful thing. We like to look at collaboration as well and measure whether people are finding that being more cognizant of the fact they think differently is improving their collaboration just from their perception. And then, although it's harder to measure, we like to at least report on examples of innovative outcomes where people have, either individuals or teams, have come together using those different brains to create solutions to tricky business problems. And I think, honestly, the logical case for that at the moment is incredibly strong. I think what we and others are looking to do is to, continually make that stronger through data from the workplace, so that that becomes, uncontestable.
Agreed. And there's a lot of data to support that. There is the opportunity, and there's a great benefit of having neurodivergent talent in the workplace. There's one particular study where neurodivergence, the companies that employ neurodivergence have seen a 28% plus increase in profit. So that speaks volumes to the benefits and the return of investment for companies. Creating the right structure and having the right inclusion mentality turn a company around in that direction.
Absolutely.
Now we come back to managers, and you touch upon this in your book, and I speak a lot about it, which is that managers need to understand that they are coaches and they need to be flexible. What suggestions would you give to businesses in developing this attitude and skill in their managers?
Well, I think it's manager training, and people look at that and think of it as a cost. I think sometimes managers look at that and see it as a chore. But I would again point to the fact that your managers have their own brain, and they are managing teams of different brains. And if they are not considering that, and the managers of your competitors are, then likely they will get better outcomes than you, including, productivity and including potentially innovation. So again, we at Uptimize, we've built what we think are effective and we see as effective and are very sort of time allowing, because we know managers are busy, but these are very time efficient training solutions where you can give a manager a training for 45 minutes or so and see a significant change in the tool set and the motivation of that manager, and that manager's ability to spot opportunities where they could apply neuroinclusion. We call it, and there's a framework for this: capability, opportunity, motivation, leading to behavior change. So building somebody's skills and tool set, building somebody's sense of where does this matter and where can I apply it, and then building their motivation of why it matters. If you do those things, you will see behavior change, and ultimately, you'll see business results.
You mentioned earlier in regards to getting responses from managers where they were skeptical and then realizing that there was a huge benefit. Is there a particular story in that regards that you could share?
Yeah, I can think of one, and this was a shared with me with one of the interviews I did. Very large company facing a real overload in communications at the beginning of the COVID crisis. I think specifically around their customers' concerns, their customers' insurance, all of these things, just the sorts of things in business that suddenly happen that nobody foresees in a chaotic kind of crisis environment. And so this organization was finding itself overwhelmed and without the systems and processes to deal with those queries and those customer support needs. And that organization actually has a hiring program for neurodivergent talent. And they very deliberately put a team together, which included some folks from that program, and said, right, here's the problem, go and try and come up with a solution. And that team very quickly worked together. So that was a particularly neurodiverse team. That team worked on a solution to handle those questions, far more smoothly, and came up with a process and came up with some technology to be able to do that in really short order. So, to me, that's an example of how you can sort of, and I hope in the future we don't have to be quite as obvious as that. I hope we just have teams that, are very neurodiverse naturally, and so, can handle those challenges, without that sort of deliberate build, if you sort of mean. But this was the case, as as we're getting there, where an organization recognized, look, we have a problem here. Let's get people who think in different ways on this, and let's see what kind of solution they can come up with. And they come up with a great solution.
Fantastic. And thank you for sharing that. Now, you mentioned in there leveraging teams. And funny enough, you happen to have a chapter with the same title. And you give some examples in that in regards to how managers and organizations can leverage having neurodiverse talent in their organizations to their benefit. Can you highlight a couple of examples from the book in that regards?
Yeah, I mean, I love the example of just problem solving, really. So we're talking about innovation, and we're talking about how do people as a team come together and figure out whatever it is, their annual strategy, their quarterly strategy, their OKRs, their goals, any process like that, which is where you're combining your team into a pool of knowledge and ideas. Unless you're just you're ignoring them, I don't recommend that. Maybe you're working on a new product together, or a product improvement or process improvement. Anytime we're combining people on these tasks, what we found with our focus groups is that people will describe having fantastic ideas, but maybe not in the way that the so-called neurotypical might expect them. And some people have very strong preferences in terms of how they problem solve, whether they like to verbally process or whether they don't, or whether they like to take all of the information that others have and review it, and then come up with some of their own thoughts and share that prior to a strategy meeting, or share that after a strategy meeting. There are all sorts of preferences here. And again, if we have a team of 5 people and they all think differently, we know that's the case by definition. Why would we not work with them to identify, look, what's the best way that you can input here? And let's allow you to do that in the way that works for you. So I think we're going to get a better solution if we do that.
Definitely coming up with communication strategies and developing communication skills is quite an important asset that is quite, I think, especially in business, overlooked and not appreciated enough, in particular when you're, as you pointed out, dealing with different types of people and how they think. Now, Ed, another aspect which we talked about in our prep talk, and it's not quite covered in your book, is that many businesses, especially small and family-run businesses, feel that they're just too small to be inclusive. From your experience, what guidance can you give them?
Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think there's ever a bad place to start. I think, frankly, the sooner you start having these conversations, the better. Because, look, even a team of 3 is 3 different brains coming together to collaborate, to work. In fact, the importance of those 3 people and their brains working to their absolute best is extra important in that team, because you're really looking to get the absolute maximum out of each person. So I would certainly take issue with the fact that this wasn't important, and even that that it's not something that you can do. And at Uptimize, we've had interest for a long time from entrepreneurs, from small organizations, coming to us and saying, hey, what can we do? And we've actually made a real effort to democratize access to some of the enterprise training resources that we've built, and provide quick access to those for smaller organizations, and indeed, individual teams and so on within larger organizations. And we're seeing that, have a real success. And I'd like to think that the entrepreneurs of the present and particularly of the future will realize that inclusion is something they need to embrace off the bat, and that tools like ours will be there to support them in that.
Fantastic answer. And I want to throw a caveat, Ed, because I want to share a story with you. Over the weekend, I had a conversation with a small business owner who was open to being inclusive and has actually made efforts to try to be inclusive, but wasn't willing to spend a penny more to provide accommodations as it could put them in the negative. But we were willing to consider if that talent could persuade him through a benefit statement. On the one hand, this is quite understandable, particularly due to the size and budget of a business. On the other hand, this can be challenging for the talent to do due to past experiences and their own particular confidence. From your booking experience, what will be a win-win for a small business and the neurodivergent talent?
Well, I think it's always, this stuff comes to life when people have an example of it. And so I think that, in the early stages here, where everything was kind of about recruitment, there was a big difference. You saw in an organization where, they'd hired 3 people, they'd hired 5 people. You could see it was a difference in how they thought about this talent, because once you can kind of personify it and say, oh, I don't, you can go from sort of, I don't know, how somebody like that would fit, to say, oh, well, we have Joanne, and Joanne's dyslexic and she's great, and she has these particular needs, but she has these great strengths. I think it's sort of easy then to build off that. So for me, the win would be not necessarily, look, neurodivergent people disclosing, but the win would be a culture where people feel comfortable, whoever they are, feel comfortable talking about their preferences, feel comfortable talking about their traits. That's the sort of culture where a neurodivergent person might then feel comfortable to disclose. And I think you can then build off that.
Right. And what you're talking about is again, creating a culture of acceptance and a culture with universal design principles and having a universal inclusion mentality where you're seeing the value and one doesn't have to disclose, and there is support without having to ask, is what you're really saying.
Exactly. And I think if you're a team of 5 and you can start having conversations where people are willing to be open about their preferences and how they work, then I think you're onto a good thing.
Fantastic. So with your book coming out next week, why should leaders read your book? And why is neurodiversity a fact of every workplace?
Well, neurodiversity is a fact of every workplace because it's a fact of humanity. So any group of people have different brains. There's no one neurodiversity writer once famously said you can't go to a museum and see, the normal brain in the jar. It doesn't exist. So therefore, any team, any organization is neurodiverse. And again, if you're not considering that, I think you're missing out in terms of how we make people feel comfortable, how we attract people, and how we get the best out of them. And I think organizations, leaders should read my book, because if they're new to this, there's a lot of stuff in my book that they'll learn very quickly that will help equip them to use some of those learnings, in their own context.
Well, lastly, Ed, you've mentioned that next week you're having your book launch. So how can people find your book and reach out to you?
Thank you. And they can find my book shortly on Amazon. They can also find it at www.hiddenforce.com. I'm also happy for people to reach out to me directly, ed@hiddenforce.com. And of course, if you're interested in bringing neuro-inclusion to your work professionally, your team, your organization, come and visit us at uptimize.com, UPTIMIZE.
And I'm sure you and I can go on for another hour talking. As you know, you and I are on the same mission. I want to thank you for being our guest and sharing your experience in bringing awareness to neurodiversity in the workplace and business with your new book. For your listeners, I encourage you to check out the show notes for the details of Ed's book, A Hidden Force. I also want to encourage you to continue to support this podcast so I can bring you more amazing content. You can do so by visiting my Patreon page, where you can connect with me more directly with several options. Till next time, take a leap and transform.